This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Bolivia's longtime president, Evo Morales, is interested in making a comeback. Today on the podcast, we'll take a big picture look at South America's poorest country and how both its economy and politics have changed since he was forced out of office in 2019.
When he started his first government, he was very charismatic, very popular, and it was good that an indigenous politician would be the president of an indigenous country. And the economy grew, etc. But also the authoritarian aspect of this is important.
This is not an endorsement, but I have found Evo Morales to be one of the most fascinating characters in Latin American politics over the last 20 years. I first interviewed Evo, as he's widely known, when he was in Bolivia's legislature. This was, I think, early 2004. And I will never forget walking through the halls of Bolivia's Congress, and they had all these photos of past congressmen over the decades. I don't remember seeing a single indigenous face until I got to Evo's office. This in a country where indigenous people make up more than 40% of the population. Evo became president not long after, and he ruled Bolivia from 2005 to 2019. Under his leadership, Bolivia defied doomsday predictions, and the economy averaged about 4.5% annual growth, GDP, over more than a decade. Now, that was double the Latin American average. Poverty fell sharply, and Bolivia's indigenous community was really empowered in a way, politically and economically, that it had never been before. Toward the end, though, things went bad. Basically, the economy began to fade. Evo refused to let go of power. He tried to run for a fourth consecutive term, even after Bolivians said in a referendum they did not want him to do that. In 2019, he went into exile amid widespread street protests and accusations that he had tried to rig an election in his favor. That brings us to today. Evo Morales is back in Bolivia, and he has just announced plans for a comeback. He wants to be the candidate of the MAS party for elections that will take place in 2025. Now, this is a pretty common story. Leader during commodities boom wants to come back. But it's complicated because the man Evo helped elect in 2020, current President Luis Arce, is actually fairly popular. Anyway, we thought all this would be a good excuse for us to take a big picture look at Bolivia, a country we probably don't talk about enough at America's Quarterly, to try to understand the current economic and political dynamics. Our guest is a friend, Raul Peñaranda. He's an award-winning journalist, the director of the news website Brújula Digital, and the president of the La Paz Association of Journalists. Raul, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian, for this invitation. I'm glad to be here.
Raul, we will eventually get into why Evo Morales is running again and what it means, but I wanted to start by establishing the current political and economic context in Bolivia.
We live in a poor country. Maybe we are the poorest country in South America, so the life is harsh for average Bolivians. We had a better situation like a decade ago or 5 years ago. Poverty was reduced, salaries went up, but now we are again in a situation where there is economic crisis and difficulties, especially for working class people.
I have heard this in multiple conversations, this idea that things are tough right now, but I look at kind of the headline numbers for Bolivia's economy. They don't look so bad. You know, GDP is expected to grow about 2% this year. Inflation is expected to be about 4%. Unemployment is 5%. I mean, these are numbers that at least superficially look better than the picture that we see elsewhere around the region. Is there more to the story here?
Yes. If you think in unemployment 5%, this is covering something that is true, that we have something like 80 to 85% of informality. We have one of the most informal economies, not even in the region, but in the world. Many people are working really in terrible conditions, and even those guys that clean the wash the windshield of a car in the light in a street is considered by Bolivian statistics as someone that is working, right? But you can imagine the income of that person. The economy can show these figures, but it's also covering, I think, that a harsh reality of poverty around 50% of the people, and a very ineffective health system, and many other problems, and also low wages. Bolivians work a lot, many hours a day, but the income, the money, the check that they take home is low. The government has been good in securing the economic stability. You mentioned the inflation, it is true. And 2% of the economy is probably the growth of the GDP for this year. But for a country with such needs, really 2% is low, and is lower than the population growth. So that means that we are getting a little bit poor, even with that GDP growth.
Just one more question on the social situation, so I understand best as I can from a distance at least the reality on the ground. What I'm hearing is that the economy is not necessarily getting worse. It's just not getting better at the speed that people became accustomed to in the 2000s and the 2010s. Which, again, to be clear, this was the period when Evo Morales was president the first time. It was a remarkable period, fueled by the natural gas that Bolivia has. Millions were lifted out of poverty. Between 2002 and 2020, the share of Bolivians living on less than $2.15 a day dropped from about 20% to only 3%. So life did get better for a while there, but I guess that people have lost that sense that life is getting better and they're feeling frustrated about it.
All those things are true, and that was fueled by our exports of natural gas, especially to Argentina and Brazil. The price was so high, a decade ago. So, but then things got a little bit worse, and then we had the pandemic. That was really terrible for the Bolivian economy, because so many people that depends on the daily income, because they are in this informal economy. And now the economy is trying to recover, but I think that our situation is not good. Different problems, a scarcity of dollars, that was something very important. Also, a big bank, a big private bank went to bankruptcy, and we have these subsidies for fuel. So the government is spending something like $1.7 billion a year in these subsidies. So those are the problems that the government has to face, I think, in some moment in the future. Our international reserves are very low now, so low that the government is not informing what's the reserves right now. Those are the problems. But the economists were saying Bolivia is on the brink of an economic crisis, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen. The government could pass this storm, pasó la tormenta, as we say in Spanish, and now the stability, of course, continues. So we have kind of problems that are under the surface, I think, that in some moment in the future, probably someone has to face them.
My question for you is, what is life like for the average Bolivian right now?
Think about 2001 in Argentina. They had this corralito. People could not retrieve their dollars, right? And there was really a crisis, and the president de la Rua had to resign, and he flew the country. And here we had a similar kind of situation. Right now, if I want to retrieve my dollars from my bank account, if I have a dollars bank account, I can only get $500 per week. The rest, I can receive it in Bolivianos at the official price, right? But somehow, after those 2 or 3 weeks of crisis, the government managed to calm down everyone, and probably also was a kind of a panic situation where everyone wanted to see what was happening, and then it stabilized. We had bankruptcy of Banco Fácil was one of the biggest banks in the country. And the same thing, queues around the bank, people trying to get their money, and the government took over the bank and distributed the assets among other banks, and also the situation stabilized. So we were really in a situation very critical at the beginning of the year, but it's not the situation anymore.
Well, and there were really two moments in recent months that conveyed this idea that maybe the government was able to avoid a crisis, but that the status quo of all these subsidies that you mentioned, the overall business and investment climate might not be sustainable. One of them was these scenes that we saw earlier this year of Bolivians lining up outside the central bank in La Paz in order to withdraw dollars. Those were images that were seen all over the Americas. And as you point out, it's never a good sign when these governments start hiding data, whether it be the Argentines a decade ago or the Chinese more recently deciding to hide their youth unemployment data. It's usually that's a signpost on the road to some kind of economic problem. But then, the second thing that really got my attention, Raul, was this idea that Bolivia may actually have to start importing gas soon. That this country that really prospered on the back of natural gas exports over the last 15 years or so, because of the lack of investment, from what I understand, is now in a situation where in the medium term, it might actually have to import from elsewhere. How did we get to that stage?
This is something structural for our future. The natural gas was the pillar of the Bolivian economy. We got taxes from that, and the government take was big from that. And now we have this inverse situation of being a net importer instead of net exporter. And this is why, because first of all, you mentioned this environment for investments is not the best. During the Evo Morales government, there was this rhetoric against any private investments in this sector. Taxes were very high. So the companies that could have invest in exploring to find new fields, they stopped doing that exactly when Evo Morales got in power. So we have more than almost, 18 years of almost no investment in Bolivia in exploration, to explore, to find new fields. Next year is going to be the last year of Bolivian exporting natural gas to Argentina, because Argentina developed Vaca Muerta and other fields, and they are producing much more gas now. And we are exporting only like less than a half of what we used to export to Brazil. And now we have this paradoxical situation where our pipeline to export natural gas to Argentina is going to be reversed, and Argentina is going to export natural gas to Brazil through Bolivia with our pipeline. And both governments are discussing right now what's going to be the fee, the commission, how much is Argentina going to pay to use those pipelines. But this is showing you the gravity of the situation. And this is also an explanation of why Bolivia has a chronic now fiscal deficit around 7% of GDP for the last decade. We spend more than we can get, and one of the reasons is the decline in the production of natural gas, hence the export of natural gas.
We'll be back after a short break. We'll ask Raul what to make of Evo Morales' return to the political stage. The America's Quarterly Podcast is sponsored in part by Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute. Since 1985, the Institute has been at the forefront of innovation in cybersecurity, national security, and public policy. You can dive into their vast library of Latin American security-focused research, explore their academic and professional programs, or tap into their open-source data initiatives. Learn more at go.fiu.edu/impact. So we have outlined the current situation. Things feel tough for ordinary Bolivians. The business climate is difficult enough that the pillars of the economy itself, look very unstable. And what we see happening in politics is, in many ways, a familiar story in Latin America, as elsewhere, frankly, in the last couple years, which is that in times of trouble, at least part of the population wants to turn to the leader who oversaw the good times. As we record this, Raul the Mas, Evo's party, is holding a conference in which they're expected to nominate him for elections that would take place in 2025. Were you surprised by his decision to try to come back?
I wasn't, Brian, because a politician like Evo Morales would never retire, never, right? He's a popular politician. He has a broad base. He's followed by indigenous population, but also popular sectors in the country. So a man like that was president for 14 years, the longest period of any Bolivian president in its history. It was obvious that he would try to come back. The problem is that in that situation, he has to antagonize with President Arce, his former ally, you know, because both want to be candidates of the Mass Party. So the party is divided, split by two. I think this big party that we had that won all the elections starting in 2005, were won by the Mass Party and Morales, but also Arce that won the last election with a big landslide. But now we have two parties actually, and two leaders that want to be chosen in 2025. If Morales can be the candidate for the party, I'm sure that Arce is gonna find another party. I'm sure that there are many political parties in Bolivia that would love to have Arce as candidate. So I think that both gonna run. I think.
I want to ask one more question about the split between Arce and Morales. It recalls, again, dynamics that we've seen elsewhere in the region in recent years. Two come to mind right away. One was when Alvaro Uribe in Colombia helped elect Juan Manuel Santos as his successor, and those two had a very quick falling out in a way that essentially fragmented Colombian politics in a similar way. Another example would be Rafael Correa helped elect his vice president, Lenin Moreno, who then did very different things at a policy level. And those two ended up being rivals as well. I mean, what can you tell us about the reasons behind the split between Arce, of course, was Morales' finance minister. What drove them apart once Arce became president? Or, was it just ego, as it may have been in some of these cases that I've mentioned?
This is a power struggle. They both want to be candidates. Evo picked Arce as the candidate in 2020 in his exile in Argentina. And probably, I don't know if it was an explicit deal that they had or implicit, that Arce would not run in 2025. Okay. And Evo would be the candidate of the party. And Evo became increasingly anxious, like 1 year ago, or probably a little bit more, when Arce was not giving any sign that he was not running in 2025. They were asking him to say, "Are you going to run as president?" And they were expecting the president to have a clear message there saying, "No, I'm not going to run for re-election." But he didn't, because, of course, power is good for anyone, for politicians, and also because he's popular in the polls. Now it's interesting to notice that Arce is more popular than Morales itself.
Why is that?
I think that because Morales is very polarizing of a figure. Of course, he has an important base, but Arce is much more calmer, and also we don't see Arce much. He has given, in almost 3 years of government, he has given only 2 press conferences. Can you imagine that? He's not all the time in the media giving interviews or things like that. And he's more moderate.
He's always struck me as a somewhat bland, inoffensive technocrat.
Exactly. The word is bland. Apparently, people like someone that is with that kind of profile, that is away of the polemics. Evo Morales has tell the harshest accusations against him, and the president has never entered in the polemic. So it's interesting that now a person like him, a blunt politician, unpassionate, suddenly is he's having around 35 to 40% of popularity, depending on the poll, which is not bad for the conditions that we're living, right? Around what Biden has in the US, and more than Boric, probably, more than Petro in Colombia, more than Fernandez in Argentina. So he's delivering, or at least the economy didn't collapse and the country is stable. We don't have inflation. We have poverty. We have these deep problems under the surface. But until those problems don't show and don't produce a real crisis, the president is actually the most popular politician in the country.
As I mentioned in the introduction, Raul, Evo Morales has struck me as one of the most fascinating, contradictory figures of Latin American politics over the last 25 years. I mean, basically this century, someone who, governed in a way, at least during the initial years, that surprised people internally and externally in a positive way. The fact that the economy grew as long as it did, that they were able to reduce poverty in the way that they did. I mean, it was a real success story for a long time. Then we had this whole, mess, for lack of a better word, in 2019. Of course, the wheels had already come off that positive story a few years prior to that. My question for you is, has he changed at all since he left office in 2019?
No, I think that he didn't. Actually, I think that the negative aspects of him are now even more evident, I think. I agree with you. When he started his first government, he was very charismatic, very popular, and it was good. It was good that an indigenous politician would be the president of an indigenous country. That was good, and the economy grew, etc. But also the authoritarian aspect of this is important. He made a plea that he would only go to one re-election when the constitution was changed, and then he said, "I tricked them. Les hice trampa. I tricked them," on the record to in a press conference, and then he lost the referendum when he asked the people if he could have the right to change the constitution to go to a fourth term, and he lost that referendum, as you know, and then he ran anyway because his friends of the constitutional court allowed that. So the authoritarian side of Morales is the most worrying side of his personality, and as I told you, is very polarizing, very tough. He never tries to give a nuanced opinion of anything. Everything is or white or black. If you're not with me, you're against me. That kind of personality, and I think that that is getting worse after 2019.
Raul, can you tell us a little bit about the opposition, who the leading figures are and what their plan is?
Right now, we have several opposition leaders. At least there is a third or more of the population in Bolivia, probably 40%, I don't know, that don't want to have a government led by the mass party in the future. So probably one of those candidates could pick up some tailwind and grow in the polls. We could divide the position into one is Carlos Mesa, a moderate, centrist, kind of a, we could say, close to a social democrat, probably. And we also have Creemos, which is a party that has a big base in Santa Cruz, which is the biggest city in the country. And the Creemos party is much more kind of a right wing or even far right political party.
I'm curious, if the elections were to happen today, what do you think the results would be?
If the elections were held today, I think that we will have 3/3, okay? Probably 1/3 with President Arce or more, maybe less than that probably Evo Morales, and another third if the opposition doesn't divide its vote in many candidates, probably one with a third. Okay, so the question is, which two of those three candidates would go to second round?
Final question for you, Raul, and it's a big one, and it's about lithium. Bolivia has the world's biggest resources of that mineral, which we all know is key to the energy transition happening all over the world. Earlier this year, there was a major development. YLB, which is Bolivia's state-owned lithium mining company, partnered with Chinese firms to build a $1 billion project to exploit these resources, which are still largely untapped. The investment climate around lithium as well has been difficult and an obstacle to a lot of this actually turning into exportable product. All these dynamics that we've been discussing here around politics, how are they likely to affect the success or failure of Bolivia's potential future as a lithium exporter in the coming years?
Thank you for this question, because I think this is very important. The government is hoping that the deals that the government has signed with two Chinese companies and one Russian company, that they committed to invest $2.8 billion. $2.8 billion, a lot of money for a country like Bolivia, for a small economy like this one, in lithium exports. But of course, you can sign many deals or agreements or whatever different is in the field if you really can make those exports. We have the biggest reserves in the world of lithium, but they are not certified, as you said. It's just an assumption. We have the biggest salt lake in the world, Uyuni, but we have to certify that, and then we have to really do our job. But I think that it's an opportunity. If we could really have the correct partners, this could change the dynamics of the economy in Bolivia. Probably again, as we depended on natural gas, now we're going to depend on lithium. Always this extractivist view of the economy. At the end, the prices go down and the country is still poor. But anyway, it's an opportunity. I think that we should hope that this could give the Bolivian economy kind of a big amount of money. But I'm not sure if this is going to be so quick in less than 2 years, right? We have elections in 2 years. So I'm almost certain that we're not going to see any product of these deals. So I think that in midterm, I think that lithium for Bolivia could be this opportunity. In the short term, I'm not sure.
It sounds to me like we should not expect, for now, lithium to be for Bolivia in the 2020s as natural gas was for Bolivia in the late 2000s.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's going to happen probably, but I think that we need more time. The prices of lithium also are, lithium carbonate are not stable in the world, right? They are changing. This year are much lower than last year. Anyway, I think that there is an opportunity for Bolivian economy there, but in the midterm, or maybe in I don't know if in the long term.
Raul, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.